Hello, my name is Thomas Hawk, and today I will be presenting Chapter 11 section on the process of death. The section over death's processes is introduced by presenting death and mourning's prevalence within the human species and mentions in passing the differences within the way separate cultures handle death. Later, the author mentions stages of reactions to death such as denial, anger, and bargaining before bringing up the importance of farewells, individual adaptations to dying, choosing where to die, and choosing when to die. The section of the book is a little dark in some instances, but the author is sure to mention death as a natural part of life. Along with these subjects, the author presents detailed graphs which display personal feedback depending on experiences that individuals going through death may have. Before a detailed exploration of subjects, the author brings up how death and mourning is continuing to change among cultures and from era to era. This is exemplified with a statement saying that 50 years ago there weren't any psychological books with dedicated chapters to the process of death. Humans typically don't welcome the idea of death, so previous psychological authors lack to mention this stage of life. The first subject brought to attention is the author's interpretation of stages of reaction to death. The stages displayed were originally presented by Kubler-Ross's book, in which the psychologist worked with terminally ill children and adults to determine the 5 stages of dying. The 5 stages determined were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It is proposed that these stages occur in an order, with one stage inevitably leading to the next. With the denial stage, a person told that they are going to die will have a response exemplified with some form of statement such as, "No, not me, this must be a mistake," or "I don't feel sick, so I must be fine." This stage of reaction to death can typically lead to denying the risk of a soon death, ignoring doctors' information, and seeking the help of multiple care providers to try and find one that will tell them that they're fine. The second stage, anger, is when a patient reacts to this news with aggression. Patients may have irrational outbursts towards family members, medical staff, or even random people. The third stage, bargaining, occurs when patients try to make a deal with the doctors or some form of higher power. An example of this could be a patient saying, "If I do everything I'm told to and listen to my doctors, can I please live until the birth of my grandchild?" or something along those lines. Fourthly is the depression stage. This happens when the disease process continues and begins having visible effects on the body. This typically causes patients to become depressed and reach the depression stage. The last stage, acceptance, occurs when a patient has understanding and readiness for death. The patient may no longer be depressed but may remain quiet and unopinionated. Next, the author mentions the importance of farewells and how it is a common process of dying. Farewells are typically in the form of letters or gifts, such as money or objects, and the most common form is face-to-face interactions. Patients who will soon die typically enjoy saying goodbye for the last time in person. To a person who is dying, saying goodbye may provide closure or peace to the person, which may cause them to disengage and reach the acceptance stage, making the process of death easier on them. After the importance of farewells are mentioned, the author presents individual adaptations to dying. The author is sure to mention how the processes of death varies largely from person to person, along with the adaptations to dying. Along with these personal changes, the way each person handles death has large variation. The book presents a study by psychologist Stephen Greer and his colleagues, in which they followed a group of 62 women diagnosed with early stages of breast cancer for a number of months, documenting their adaptation along the way in a longitudinal study. Patient reaction to diagnosis and treatment allowed Greer to distinguish 5 different classifications. The first classification is positive avoidance or denial. In this section, the patient rejects the diagnosis of cancer from the doctor. Secondly is the fighting spirit. This is when the patient shows optimism and actively searches for additional information about the disease she's been diagnosed with. Third is stoic acceptance or fatalism. A patient in this stage will acknowledge the diagnosis but doesn't wish to seek further information or help and continues to live their normal lives. Fourthly is the helplessness-hopelessness stage. In this stage, patients appear overwhelmed and don't express signs of hope. Lastly is the anxious preoccupation stage. Patients in this stage will respond to diagnosis with high levels of anxiety and will constantly worry about signs from their body as indications of the disease. After documenting these reactions with patients, the researchers concluded that most patients, no matter their reaction, would experience negative physical effects such as high blood pressure. The next section presented is choosing where to die. The author notes that most patients in the United States prefer to die in their homes, but most appear to die in hospitals and nursing homes. This is exemplified with patients who are in terminal care. In a study following 96 end-stage cancer patients, 84% of the patients wished to be taken care of at home, and 71% of them wished to die in their homes. The author then presents hospice care, which is care of patients centered on pain relief and emotional support rather than treatment. However, there are problems associated with dying at home, in hospice care, or in a hospital. Figure 11.1 from the book displays problem areas associated with patients at home with home care nursing, in hospitals, in a nursing home, or at home with hospice care. The graph clearly illustrates high indications of lack of emotional support for patients who are at home with home care nursing, in hospitals, or in nursing homes. At-home hospice care seems to have approximately 35% of individuals reporting lack of emotional support, but this is still much lower than other end-of-life accommodations. Interestingly, at-home hospice care patients reported the lowest amount of issues in nearly every section, exceptions being lack of help with breathing and lack of communication with a physician. The author then mentions the importance of a good death in hospice care, meaning that a patient dies with dignity, minimum pain, and maximum consciousness. With this in mind, the first appearance of hospice care occurred in England around the 1960s and made its way to the United States by the 1970s. Today, there are thousands of Americans in hospice care, with nearly 500,000 terminally ill patients being cared for. The author then mentions the hospice approach and its aspects. The first aspect of the hospice approach is control over the care receiving setting is in the hands of the family and patient. Next is that the patient should be alleviated of pain and their comfort levels should be maximized. Thirdly, deaths should be viewed as normal, inevitable parts of life which should be accepted. Lastly, there is a trained team composed of physicians, nurses, therapists, and social workers dedicated to caring for the patients in hospice. Lastly, this section of the book mentions choosing when to die. The author presents numerical data stating that 90% of people who die each year do so after experiencing prolonged illness and constant steady decline. Many of the people who are experiencing these prolonged illnesses would believe that they should have some say in when they can die. This brings up the idea of physician-assisted suicide, which is where physicians are allowed to administer medications that will end the patient's lives in a peaceful way. This is an act passed by Oregon voters titled the Death with Dignity Act. Many people disagreed with this act in the beginning, but it was still practiced. The first year that this act was active, 24 people received prescriptions of physician-assisted suicide, and 16 of them used it to end their lives. More recently, in 2012, 115 prescriptions were written by many different doctors, with the average age of the patient being 69. Of these patients, most were white, about half had at least a bachelor's degree, 3/4 of them had cancer, and nearly all of them died at their homes or were in hospice care. 100% of the patients prescribed had some form of health insurance, which eradicated the hypothesis that patients were choosing to die to avoid paying for medical treatments. Patients most frequently provided reasoning behind physician-assisted suicide was the loss of autonomy, meaning that the patient could no longer truly experience their lives due to the illness that they had. It is proposed that physician-assisted suicide results in a good death for the patient, but many disagree with this option of healthcare. In conclusion, the process of death among patients globally is much more complicated than many would anticipate. Individuals' adaptations to dying seem to occur in an unpredictable way among patients responding to the diagnosis of cancer, while stages of reactions to death seem to occur in a sequential order, with one stage leading to the next before the patient finally reaches acceptance. The importance of farewells among dying patients is seen to provide much-needed closure and peace for patients who may be in the end-of-life stages. Choosing when and where to die are very important aspects to patients who are terminally ill, but both propose issues such as choosing to be at home with hospice care, in a hospital, or in a nursing home. Issues associated with choosing when to die is mainly tied to physician-assisted suicide and morality of the decision. Thank you very much for watching my presentation on the process of death, and I hope you can continue today with knowledge previously unacquired.